Welcome to Murder Mile UK True Crime. This isn't a video, it's an audio experience. The only images you'll need for this episode are these. So close your eyes, open your mind, and savour the sounds of Murder Mile. So who was the Twilight Sex Killer? Find out on Murder Mile. Today I'm standing on St George's Drive in Pimlico, SW1. 4 streets southeast of Maggie's Fall, 2 streets west of Martha Browning's deadly alibi, 4 streets east of the woman in red, and yet a full 3.5 miles south of the murderer of Norman Rickard, as covered last week on Murder Mile. At 29 St George's Drive stands yet another 5-storey mid-Victorian terraced house on the corner of a busy street, and just a short walk from a tube station, not dissimilar to Norman's. Today it's an affordably priced hotel for city breakers called the 29, with good showers so you can scrub away the London filth, and soft beds so you can cry yourself to sleep having been fleeced in London, Europe's biggest rip-off. Yet if true crime is your thing, the front first-floor room was once the scene of a little-known sex killer. On Monday the 19th of February 1962, the same day that Norman Rickard's body was found, 23-year-old Alan Vigar, who was also a quiet, handsome and secretly gay man, was strangled to death in the privacy of his own flat by a tall and attractive man that the police believe he had picked up in Piccadilly Circus. Both men had invited him in, undressed, willingly been tied up, and asphyxiated as part of this sex play. With the killer leaving no fingerprints, witnesses, or obvious motive, although the coroner ruled this murder by persons unknown as a sex game gone wrong, with a serial killer potentially stalking the city's gay men, police started looking for links in unnervingly similar killings across London, Kent, Derbyshire, West Germany, even Zurich. And although Albert Day had seen the suspect with Norman Rickard, no one knew his name, yet the press had already dubbed him the Twilight Sex Killer. But who was he? My name is Michael, I am your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 315, The Twilight Sex Killer, Part 2. Like Norman, Alan was gay and lived in a world where it was illegal to be gay, and yet he was. Alan John Vigar was born in March 1939 in Tenterden, Kent. An oldie-worldy ancient town full of quaint tea rooms, church fetes, a blacksmith, maybe a maypole, Morris dancers, a pelting stock, and as a site of a very English culture. Like Norman's town, it was a place where people and ideas do not change. Raised by Robert, an aging father, who had 2 previous wives and many other children, Alan was the youngest son of Eleanor Vigar, with his older brother Kenneth being the one who married and had a child. And although as a shoesmith in the Royal Field Artillery awarded the Star a military medal, Robert wanted his son to follow him into the services. Knowing that he was gay, and that he wanted to be who he wanted to be, instead of being trapped by a career as Norman was, Alan chose to enter the arts. Aged 23, and said to be 5'6", slim, with fair hair in a quiff, Alan was softly spoken and quiet, polite and well-mannered, and never discussed his love life, even though he had always worked in industries where gay men flourished. He'd been a window dresser in Croydon. He was briefly a male model. He joined the BBC as a costumier. And he was now a wardrobe boy at Teddington Studios, working on the ABC TV comedy series Our House, starring Hattie Jakes, Charles Hawtrey, Joan Sims, and Bernard Bresslaw. Bernard recalled,
"He'd been my dresser for the past 26 weeks. He was extremely efficient
and never talked about his private life. Filming every Saturday and Sunday, Monday was his day off. And paying £3.10 a week, Alan occupied the front first-floor flat, a small serviced room at 29 St George's Drive, of which the landlady, Miss Olive Molyneux, described him as the best tenant in the house, which the housekeeper, Frederica Thornton, stated he was a very nice man indeed. Being private, she said, the only woman who visited him was his mother, and I never heard any disturbances from his room. Like Norman, he was stylish and neat. Last seen wearing a fawn mohair jacket with knitted sleeves, a brown shirt, black and white tight-fitting trousers, black casual shoes, and brown sheepskin gloves. But unlike Norman, having his own car, he often picked up men in his slightly battered Hillman Minx. And again, unlike Norman, Alan was comfortable with his sexuality, but it still had to be a secret. On Sunday the 18th of February 1962, the day before his death, and when Norman's body was found, he met his brother and his mother in Westerham in Kent, and was said to be excited about his holiday in Italy, which rules out any hint that it could have been a suicide. The next day, Monday the 19th, Frederica the housekeeper saw him at 10 a.m, leaving with Alfred Abbott, a foreman who he'd known for about a year. She normally cleaned his room at about 11:30 a.m, but as he'd been away, he asked her not to bother. He departed a little after that, leaving his car as he wanted a drink. It was a typical day for an ordinary man enjoying his life. As planned, Alan and Albert headed to several different milliners in Knightsbridge, Victoria and Piccadilly as he was looking to buy a hat. Mid-afternoon, as they sat in a coffee house near Piccadilly Circus, Alan suddenly excused himself, saying he wanted to speak privately to an unnamed and unidentified man who Albert said Alan had been eyeing up. He was gone for 5 minutes. It was never said what they spoke about, and the man was never identified. Was this the same place in Piccadilly that Norman was last seen in? We shall never know. That afternoon they strolled the West End, and having parted ways outside of the Ritz Cinema in Leicester Square at exactly 5 p.m, it is uncertain if Alan had planned to meet Albert again that evening, as Albert called the communal phone several times at 29 St George's Drive from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. Only Alan wasn't in. Did Alan snub Albert Abbott, as Norman had with Albert Day? Or was this just a coincidence? Like Norman, instead of going home, Albert headed back to Piccadilly Circus, and at 7:30 p.m, he entered a cellar bar called Ward's Irish House, where he got chatting to an unnamed guardsman he had known for about 6 months. At the coroner's inquest, the guardsman confirmed that they parted at 8:20 p.m. at Piccadilly Circus, stating, Alan was tipsy but not drunk. He wasn't worried or frightened, and he said he was going to meet someone. But who that person was is unclear. It was a 25-minute journey, but he wasn't seen until 9:50 p.m. So although an hour is missing from his timeline, like Norman, his last ever sighting alive was captured as he entered his home. But whereas it is said that most eyewitnesses are only 30% accurate, this sighting was by possibly the best witness. Sergeant William Wotherspoon, a plainclothes detective from the Met Police, was sat in a bay window on the ground floor sitting room next door at 27 St George's Drive, overlooking the busy intersection. With a notepad, he was keeping surveillance on a nearby building, and at 9:50 p.m, I saw Alan, who I'd known for about a year but never spoke to, coming from the direction of Eccleston Square. Trained to accurately record details, William told the inquest,
"I had a good look at them both and took a note of the other man.
but as they passed his window,
I didn't see if they entered number 29.
In fact, nobody did. William described this man as aged 23 to 26, a similar age to the suspect last seen with Norman, as well as also slim, 5'10", well-built, clean-shaven with classic features. Expanding this, that he had
A pointed chin, a high forehead, was effeminate, and was extraordinarily well dressed.
wearing a dark brown wind cheater or raincoat, which was zipped up at the front. And although some of these details don't match the man seen with Norman, as this man had thick fair hair rather than dark, did Albert Day get this detail wrong? Because being snubbed was his focus on Norman and not his date. Of course, if he was the killer, this man who may have accompanied Alan to his flat could have been wearing a wig or maybe dyed his hair. But if he really wanted to disguise himself, why didn't he wear glasses or a hat? Either way, no one could confirm or refute if this was the same man as Norman's suspect until much later. Whatever time Alan entered his lodgings at 29 St George's Drive, as per usual, no one heard him open the door, climb the stairs, or enter his room. Frederica, the housekeeper, was in all night and stated, "I didn't hear a thing." No voices, no bangs, and no struggle. Just the delicate sound of music and silence. As with Norman, no one suspected that anything was wrong, and all stated it was an uneventful night. The next morning, on Tuesday the 20th of February, around the time of Norman's autopsy at St Pancras Mortuary, Frederica was doing her rounds, and with most of the residents out, she was going from room to room with her hoover, dusters and cleaning box. At 11:15 a.m, her usual time, even though she knew that Alan would be out, being polite, she knocked at his door, and getting no reply, she opened it with a passkey. Was this why Norman Rickard's killer had locked him in a wardrobe? Did he believe that Norman may have had a housekeeper, so he hid the body in a locked cupboard so it wouldn't be found for days? We don't know. Inside Alan's one-roomed lodging was a bed, a set of drawers and a washstand, but no wardrobe. As usual, it was neat and clean, with no signs of forced entry or disturbance. But the second Frederica walked in, knowing Alan, she knew that something wasn't right. His shoes were by the door, and last night's clothes had been neatly folded over the back of 2 fireside chairs. But he hadn't made his bed. Alan always made his bed. Always. So with the curtains closed and the bedside lamp previously broken, it looked as if he had bunched up his crinkled sheets into a large messy lump in the middle of the bed. And spotting a towel ominously draped over the pillow, as she removed it, she was confronted by a horrible sight. The bulging eyes of Alan's contorted and discoloured face. This is where the confusion often sets in, as the first officer on the scene had arrived to what was described to him as an attempted suicide. As with the witness being so shocked, mistakes were easily made. The investigation was headed up by Detective Superintendent Fred Cornish, a different detective to the one tracking Norman's killer, as although both murders occurred in London, they were both in different boroughs. But the second the details were released that another young, handsome gay man was found in his own room, naked, bound and strangled, the gay men of London were already calling for the police to catch and convict him before he kills again, and the press had already dubbed him the Twilight Sex Killer. The similarities between both murders were startling. The room didn't look like a typical murder scene, just as Norman's had been mistaken, at least for a week, as that of a missing person. There was no struggle, no ransacking, no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no obvious motive. In fact, it took days to discover that a few items were missing: an electric razor, a cigarette case, 2 leather jackets, and his wallet. So if he hadn't hidden his most valuable personal possessions as Norman had, this could suggest that his killer wasn't a stranger. So was this a robbery, a sex game gone wrong by an opportunist thief? Or was the theft a red herring? The police issued photographs and descriptions of the jackets as being of high quality and no longer being produced. Rather than being destroyed, they were more likely to be sold or worn by the killer. But this line of inquiry resulted in a dead end. Like Norman, the body was examined in situ by a Home Office pathologist, this time Dr. Donald Tier. Based on the decomposition, the time of death was established as between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. But with a 25% margin of error owing to the house's intermittent heating, this was extended to 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. A timing which was as good as useless. As before, Alan was naked, having willingly undressed and got into bed, which either suggests he knew his killer, or that, being so used to bringing strangers back to his flat for sex, that this was normal. Which again is as good as useless. With no signs of force or assault, Alan had allowed his hands to be tied behind his back using a red, blue and yellow cord of a bathrobe, similar to the kind used to strangle Norman, and it didn't belong to either of Alan's 2 bathrobes, and the one that had been used to kill Norman was still around his neck. So did the killer bring the bathrobe cord with him, or was he already wearing a bathrobe? If so, why? Again, forensic analysis was unable to determine if he'd been sexually assaulted. Again, the motive was hard to prove. Again, he'd been strangled from behind, laying face down on the bed. But with the cord used to bind his wrists, his killer had grabbed Alan's cotton vest from the chair. With one hand he'd held him down, as fingernail abrasions had embedded into his left shoulder. And as if he was pulling the reins of a horse, he'd pulled the vest tight with his right hand, forcing Alan's face deep into the pillow. Alan was strangled and suffocated. And again, before he died, he didn't have time to cry out or scream. Even though it had taken his killer 2 attempts to take his life, as around his neck were 2 ligature marks, both made by the vest being 7 inches long, but they were 3/4 of an inch apart. Seeing the similarities, Detective Superintendent Cornish teamed up with Detective Superintendent Hare, who was investigating Norman's killing, as there was a possibility that the cases were linked. Like Norman, Alan kept a diary of the men he had sex with. Police initially suspected that he may have been killed, as working in television, he knew many celebrities who were secretly gay.
But there were no famous names, no royals, nor anyone who would cause a scandal.
So it was dropped as a motive. Again, as every clue only led to dead ends and silences, with no evidence pointing to an obvious killer, the people in the press went into overdrive, and even the police targeted any man who fitted the brief, whether he was violent, sadistic, gay, or looked a little like the suspect Alan had seen with Norman. On the 16th of March, an unnamed gay soldier who'd gone AWOL since Christmas was questioned and put on an ID parade in front of the key witnesses: Albert Day, Sergeant Wotherspoon, Alfreda Venant, and the unnamed guardsman, who all may have seen the killer. But none of them picked him out. On the 23rd of July, a ship's steward, whose own colleagues on board the Rangitoto had alerted the police to this possible suspect, who was gay and looked like the identikit posted in the press. But again, the ID parade failed. He also had a perfect alibi, as on the day that Norman and Alan were murdered, he was on board this P&O liner, surrounded by 400 passengers, and was halfway across the Pacific. He later stated,
"It's my misfortune that I'm supposed to look like the man seen with Alan Vigar."
And also fearing some repercussions, he stated,
"I've been treated well by the police during my interviews."
This wasn't the only desperate connection made, as many leads ended with a wall of silence by the gay men of London, who felt that they were being persecuted as suspects, rather than possible victims. But as before, many of this was confused as attention seekers came out of the woodwork seeking notoriety. On Sunday the 25th of February, Patrick Lambert, a 32-year-old chef from Maidstone in Kent, claimed,
"Last Sunday,
the day before Alan's murder and Norman's body was found,
I had a drink in a Soho pub. At 10 p.m, I strolled to Piccadilly Circus tube station. I met a good-looking young man. We chatted. He told me his name was Johnny
he was Scots-Irish,
and had left prison recently after serving time for robbery.
which of course will ring a bell.
He wore a raincoat, grey flannel trousers. His hair was dark and brushed back. I agreed to put him up for the night. We had tea and cake in Victoria train station.
And arriving back at Patrick's flat,
I dozed off. Suddenly, the man threw himself at me and squeezed my throat. There was nothing I could do. I couldn't scream.
and collapsing unconscious, Johnny stole £3 from his wallet and then fled. So certain were the police that it was him, that they visited many of the gay clubs in Soho, showing regulars the identikit and warning them,
"If you see this man, call us immediately. Do not take him home."
but as we know, with a provable alibi to the murders of Alan and Norman, he was released without charge. Patrick's story could be true, but every detail he states is identical to those already printed in the newspapers, except for one fact: that the strangulation happened during sadomasochistic sex. And in his story, there was none. Running out of patience, the police headed further into their rogues gallery, questioning Jack Murray, owner of the Alibi Club in Soho, which allegedly both Alan and Norman had frequented, as he had been convicted in Tangiers for leading young men into debauchery. But again, his alibi was solid, as he was in prison during both murders. On the 14th of March, they interviewed an unnamed Spanish hotel porter living in London, who was Interpol's #1 suspect in the murder of a Swiss postman, Heinrich Geiner, in Zurich, just weeks before both murders. With Heinrich found naked, tied up with his hands behind his back, and strangled with his face down on his pillow, Spanish porter was questioned by the Met's detective. But he didn't match the description, and he also had a strong alibi, not only for the murders in London, but for the one in Zurich. So were either of these men the killer? But the police had failed to catch him, as they were too fixated on believing that the eyewitness descriptions were accurate in the hunt for this possible serial killer. Or does this simply show how common this kind of murder actually is? Because as proven, it can't all be one man. Are we seeing similarities because we want to see similarities, and ignoring the differences because they're more likely to point to it being 2, 3, or maybe several suspects who are unconnected? Every angle had to be investigated, so police also explored the possibility that the Twilight Sex Killings of London could also be linked to the bubble car murders of Derbyshire, also known as the carbon copy murders. 3 murders in Chesterfield in Germany linked to a convicted killer, 23-year-old Michael Copeland. But although, without doubt, they'd been convicted by the same maniac who had an intolerable hatred of gays, 60-year-old William Elliot was stamped and kicked to death. 48-year-old George Stubbs was battered to death. Gunter Himbrecht was stabbed 37 times, and there was no sadomasochistic sex involved. Michael Copeland voluntarily confessed to those 3 murders and was convicted in 1965. When the Met Police questioned him about the deaths of Alan Vigar and Norman Rickard, he had no knowledge of it at all. And although he looked slightly similar to the identikit, he wasn't 5'10", but a huge 6'4". No one could mistake him for anyone else, given how flawed eyewitness descriptions are. They even investigated a possible link to Ellen Braben, a 72-year-old widow who was found strangled to death in her basement flat at nearby 77 St George's Drive. And again, the press tried to dig up dirt to link Alan to William Vasily, who sold secrets to Russia. But why would there be any link? The nearest the police got to a link was, as we've covered before, the murder of Vincent Patrick Carey on the 2nd of December 1964 at Carroll House in Bayswater. He was found in bed, strangled, face down, with his hands tied behind his back. There was no sexual assault, and nothing seemed to have been stolen. He too was living a double life as he worked for the police. And although 3 men, John Simpson, William Dunning and Michael Odam, were later acquitted, it's likely that they pretended to be gay to rob him. On the 13th of April 1962, Alan Vigar was buried at the St Mary the Virgin Church in West Ham. Detectives were in attendance to pay their respects, but also to see if the killer was watching. But this proved fruitless. On the 18th of May, 3 months after the murders, having deliberated for just 5 minutes, the jury returned a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown, the same as Norman Rickard. Alan was blamed for his own death, as coroner Gavin Thurston stated,
Whether it had been some kind of perverted play that got out of hand is impossible to say.
And as of today, the case remains unsolved. So who was the Twilight Sex Killer? We may never know, as there were 2 mistakes in the reporting of Norman's murder, where many witnesses got their information, and in the investigation itself. Albert Day, the man who was snubbed by Norman that evening, described the man he was seen walking home with as 20 to 23, 5'10" to 11, broad shoulders, athletic, oval or round face, dark brown brushback hair with a fresh complexion, dark trousers and a grey wool gabardine raincoat. And although eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable, the police made and distributed an identikit based on it. That was the first mistake. Alan's detailed description of the suspect was wrong, as the tall, dark-haired German girl, Elfriede Wienand, who Norman got chatting to in Piccadilly Circus, caught the tube back home with him to Maida Vale, and living at 11A Elgin Avenue, just 1 block south. He was escorting her home. Albert Day didn't see a man, but a taller-than-average woman with short dark hair wearing masculine clothes. He didn't notice this, as being upset at being snubbed, his focus was on Norman, not the girl. And even if this suspect, whether male or female, was Norman's killer, we know he didn't die that night. Saturday the 10th of February was the last time that he was seen alive, and even though a pathologist could only state that he'd been dead for at least a week, and no one had seen or heard from Norman after that moment, we know he was alive at least at 1 p.m. on Sunday afternoon, almost a day later. Being a weekend, he did as he always did. He had breakfast, he got dressed, and with the plan to pick up a stranger for sex, he hid his jewellery and his wallet in the usual places. At 1 p.m, even though nobody saw or heard him, we know he listened to the lunchtime news on the radio, as he wrote about it in a letter to his father and his stepmother posted that afternoon. He wrote,
Just going for lunch. The weather said it's going to rain this afternoon, so I'll go for a walk before the rain comes.
It was a small overlooked detail which most of the press missed, as they were too focused on their hunt for a salacious sex killer and serial killer of London's gay men, rather than seeing this obvious fact. That day, although he wasn't seen, Norman must have caught his usual bus to Speaker's Corner. And being professionally discreet, he brought a stranger back to his flat, and that man was seen by no one. So who was the Twilight Sex Killer? Nobody knows. But as riddled as both murders are with coincidences, the only way it's ever going to be solved is to seek out the differences and not the similarities in the hunt for a serial killer.